Thanks, Sarah, for the warm introduction, and welcome to our panel. We're going to spend some time talking a little bit about cross-border investment, cross-border fundraising, and do most of it through, I think, a little bit of storytelling. Sarah's already introduced me, but I'm going to let the guys give you a few minutes of who they are, their accomplishments, and what their companies and funds do. They're unbelievably accomplished people, and I'd like to hear their story before we get started.
Cool. Well, thank you for that, the kind words. So my name is Mike Silagadze. I founded Top Hat more or less straight out of university, so that's all I've done with my life. What Top Hat does, for those of you that don't know of the company, is we're a platform for teaching in higher education. In particular, professors use it to replace their old school paper-based textbooks, to engage their students in class, and create really interactive homework experiences for their students. We've got millions of students at I think 75% of the universities in North America at this point. We're growing really quickly. We just opened an international office in Australia, and going really well.
Hi, my name's Lylan. Okay, I'll just ignore it. With White Star Capital, we have offices in New York, where I'm located, here in Montreal, London, UK, and Paris, France, and we're really a transatlantic investor. We like companies that see a global audience. Even though I'm in a New York office, I'm originally from Cornwall, Ontario, just down the 401, or the Highway 20, Waterloo alum, and really built my career as a head of product, head of engineering at companies big and small. And my largest success was helping scale a business called Aquantive, where we doubled and tripled the business year over year. And in my 5th year, in 2007, Microsoft acquired us for $6 billion. And so it was the kind of experience that every investor wants to be part of.
That's awesome. So some very accomplished operational experience coming from you also. Just by way of show of hands, how many of you in the audience are entrepreneurs? Oh, wow, that's awesome. How many of you are raising your Series A round? How many of you are thinking of raising a Series A round? Better question. How many of you are thinking of raising a Series B round, later stage? Oh, hey. Ottawa. Okay, that gives us a bit of a frame of reference then. So, first of all, let's maybe talk about the challenges of raising money today in the context of what it was like to raise a few years ago. So, Mike, you raised your Series A for Top Hat, and then you completed a Series B. Maybe walk us through what that storyboard looked like from the Series A to Series B round, and what has stayed the same and what has changed in terms of raising that capital before we get into the cross-border discussion.
So a ton has changed. I mean, we've been around for what seems like forever at this point. We got started kind of in 2010-ish time frame, and things have changed so drastically. I would say in 2010, there really was no ecosystem in Canada or in Toronto. There were a handful of companies that were doing something, but there was no groundswell of activity at that point. There were hardly any investors. I mean, it took us 6 months to raise our first round of angel financing. Part of that was because we were in education, which nobody wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole for good reason. But part of it just there were no active investors. So it was incredibly difficult compared to today, where there's a huge amount of activity. There's thousands of interesting companies in the ecosystem. Things have gotten a lot better. There was a period a few years ago where things got really frothy, and now they've kind of calmed down a little bit. But still, it's probably several orders of magnitude more activity than there was, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So that's awesome. The other thing I'll mention that's changed, which is remarkable, I would say, and it's happened over the last 5 or so years, is companies like CB Insights, and I think Mattermark, I think is the name of the company, are basically these massive databases that investors can now subscribe to and now have an awareness of basically every company in the ecosystem. And what that's done is made it significantly easier for companies in Canada to access investors outside of the ecosystem. So that now if you're on the radar at all, if you're growing on LinkedIn, I mean, you don't even need to be pitching anybody. All you need to do is just be active as a business. You're immediately going to get noticed. For a company at scale like Top Hat, we'll get investor outreach probably 5 times a week. We'll have various analysts kind of reaching out saying, hey, we should have an introductory meeting, which is radically different than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, that was almost non-existent, and you kind of had to be in the Bay Area or New York or Boston. So that's all exciting. I mean, these are all awesome changes that have happened over the last 5 years.
Another thing I see from entrepreneurs a lot, where they have mentors who are a little bit older, the expectations of what level of business you have, what level of traction you have to raise whatever round, even a seed, our expectations are much higher in terms of traction than they ever used to be, because it costs less to build these businesses. And also just the terminology has changed. What was seed is now pre-seed and so on. But at the end of the day, investors who used to just look at ideas and napkins are now saying, why don't you have $100,000 a month in revenue?
Yeah, that's an important one. The revenue ask is a big one now, particularly at the early stage. So companies like the ones in this audience, primarily going into Series A, revenue is I'd say it's probably at the top of the list of questions being asked by investors, pretty much anywhere. With respect to the, part of the theme of this panel is related to cross-border capital raising. The difference between Canada and the U.S. But Lylan, in your case, you're an investor, a global investor, but you also have global LPs. So, what is, from the standpoint of an entrepreneur coming to you looking for capital, what are the similarities and differences that you're looking for in that company that you're going to invest in, and what is the impact of your LP base on your decision making relative to making that investment?
With our LPs, and with each fund, any VC firm promises to invest along certain themes, certain theses. For us, the 3 of them are fintech, disruption of commerce, and IoT and algorithms. And no matter whether it's in France, Montreal, UK, Sweden, New York, we invest along those 3 theses. And we look for this similar kind of traction. Now, where there are geographic differences are especially along certain hubs. So if you think about where are the fintech hubs, well, that'd be more Toronto than Montreal. If you think about gaming or maybe some e-commerce, someone could argue that'd be more Montreal than Toronto. And so there is a gravitational pull on certain theses for specific cities in any region of the world.
So, Mike, walk us through your process. You've got some pretty significant investors in Top Hat. Some big guys, some big guys. Maybe tell us about your fundraising process from the standpoint of how did we've got Lylan sitting here, global investor, some of your investors like Georgian and Inovia, Canadian based, but also your US guys. What criteria did you use to actually go out and fundraise, and what did you use to help yourself and the company select those investors as your investors? Because it makes a difference, and I think it maybe explain to us what the difference was between how you worked with the Canadians versus how you worked with some of the others.
So I'll talk maybe about the differences between raising angel capital, seed capital, and late stage capital, because it's a completely different universe. When you're raising an angel or seed round of financing, the investors are really at that point investing in you, in the founding team. There may be some revenue, there may be a business, but it's typically not of material size. It's really more the promise and the vision that you can convey. So that's completely different. When you're raising money at the later stage, when you've got, let's say 10 million is the growth stage cutoff. Let's say you're raising at 10 million plus in revenue. They're typically investing in a real business, and you're going to be valued for better or for worse based on actual metrics, your unit economics, your SaaS metrics, and how quickly you're growing and all that kind of stuff. And those are completely different universes. The one general advice I would say in terms of our process, and we totally screwed this up in our early days, and I would say did it a little bit more effectively in our later rounds of financing, is you can't decide that you're going to raise funding and then start talking to investors. You need to build these relationships. In both our Series B and C round, which we recently closed, we had been talking to the investors that ultimately ended up leading our rounds for on the order of a year to 2 years prior to that, keeping in touch with them, meeting them for coffee and giving them updates on how the business is going. We did some, especially in our Series B, sort of introductory pitches where we get introduced, we do the pitch and have a follow-on meeting and so on. Those meetings ended up not going very far compared to the ones where we already had a level of comfort with the investors. It's a little bit more challenging if you're a first-time entrepreneur and you're raising your first rounds of financing. But even there, you probably want to keep in touch with someone for a period of a few months before you raise. What you really want to be doing is say, we're not raising until someone almost comes to you with a preemptive term sheet. And then you say, all right, fine, we're raising. And then you go to all the investors that you've been speaking with and say, hey, we're finally going to raise. We're hoping to close in 2 weeks. Let's get this done. So that's the ideal case. It's very difficult to it's easier said than done. But that's the key thing that I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to make a mistake is they think, all right, I'm going to wait until I'm raising to start talking to people. Now, to your other question with respect to how we chose our investors, I would say that's also probably stage dependent because in the early days, when you're doing your first round of financing, with very few exceptions, you're not choosing anyone. You're basically taking whoever is willing to write you a check. You don't have the luxury of choosing. Once you're at a certain scale and you've got, and you're in the sort of premium category, which we're fortunate enough to be in this round, then you have a choice. And then you look at things like dilution, like the reputation of the fund. You tend to look at funds that have a reputation of being founder friendly. And things, the amount of capital that you want to raise and so on. So then you can start dealing with the mechanics, but those are almost less relevant than making sure the business is at a stage where you can have the luxury of doing that.
On what you were saying earlier about keeping in touch with investors, I've had some experiences that were surprising to me where I identified some companies that I thought could be interesting. I reached out to the entrepreneurs, hey, I think your business is interesting, do you want to meet? And they said, you know what, I just closed my seed round, enough fundraising right now, so no. And by the last you can tell that it's a little bit of a surprising experience, but it happens often. And one of the biggest concerns for me is, well, one, clearly I won't be able to track this company the way I would and develop a relationship. But more so, even if I were to invest in a next round 12 months from now, that means you're not going to be networking with Series B investors also because you don't believe in building those relationships. And that's also all the more scary.
All about relationships. Marriage. Oh, good. We'll talk. Well, you can tell us about it. We all know that when you get investment, and it's the same for the venture capital investor, you're getting into a relationship for a very long period of time. Hopefully that relationship goes well. But oftentimes, as the company gets built, there are a few bumps in the road and a few challenges. So, Lylan, I'll start with you on this one. You're a Canadian, but you invest globally. What is the way? Well, first of all, what are your terms for an investment that you would make? And then secondly, what do you bring to the party after that investment, post the investment, when you're sitting on the board and trying to add value? What does that look like?
Yeah, so on the Canadian side, I've got the phone to prove it. This is awesome in New York when people are taking pictures. And the criteria does not change internationally. Except for some things that people talk about all the time, tax credits and the ability to keep your employees longer and that kind of thing. So some of the spreadsheet modeling changes, but at the end of the day, the criteria is, do we think you can be a billion-dollar company someday, or a times 20 exit someday, or what have you. In terms of, you mentioned earlier, being founder-friendly and being helpful, it's so much more than the board meetings. An investor who just thinks that they should spend a few hours once every 3 months with you to go over a board deck is often one of the worst investors you can have, because there's so much more to do. There's, on the B2B side, if a startup is B2B, I take pride in being able to introduce them to talent, of course, but also to clients. I've literally made intros that have resulted in like $1 million plus clients. That's important. The mentorship about how to structure your KPIs so that when you're ready to raise the next round, your numbers are already prepared exactly for how your next round potential investors want to see them. And then the hard-to-handle situations, that 3 o'clock in the morning phone call about something blowing up or some employee leaving or some coup happening, and just being able to just do whatever it takes to make it happen. The other day I was hearing a story about John Doerr, one of the most legendary investors in the history of VC. One of his startups got this massive boom in business, and then shortly after the servers crashed, John Doerr went to the office and acted like he was the head of customer service, right? And was the customer service person. That's what a real investor does, is I am a shareholder in this company and I need to see this company successful.
And Mike, do you think that changes between investors on different continents or in different parts of the world? You've got different investors. You've got Canadians, you've got some U.S. guys. Does it differ?
So, I'm only familiar, I guess, with U.S. and Canada, so I'll leave my comments to that. Canadian VCs for a long time, less so today, but for a long time had a pretty bad reputation. There was a reputation of investing in startups the way you might invest in, shopping malls, where you're trying to squeeze the founders for a little, a few percent more equity, or put in some weird terms into the deal to try and get a little bit more leverage. Thankfully, that kind of behavior doesn't exist as much anymore. It's sort of been filtered out of the ecosystem. But that's one thing that I think has been a very healthy change that's happened is the U.S. style of investing, or maybe more accurately Silicon Valley style of investing, has sort of permeated the culture in Canada. And so broadly speaking, investors are pretty similar now. Georgian Partners has led our Series B, and they're a Canadian through and through investor, and they've been awesome. They've been just as helpful and successful in many ways as any of our U.S. investors. So I think there's a certain right way of doing it in terms of investing in startups, and that right way has become kind of the norm, which is, I think, a very positive change.
That's great. More pervasive than it used to be back in the day. Lylan, do you see the same thing from the other side of the table? So do you see that again, you're cross-border, but globally also, and there are companies that I know in our portfolio that will be looking to, Asia, and not just the U.S. but Asia and Europe to raise capital for their Series A and B. What are you seeing in terms of the similarities or differences between those groups in terms of behavior, the VCs in terms of behavior relative to those entrepreneurs?
Yeah, well, I'd say Europe and Asia are quite different, and of course countries within those regions are different from each other. But to generalize a little bit, when you have less mature VC ecosystems, some of the questions are sometimes a little bit more old school. If we're talking with investors who have investment banking backgrounds instead of operating backgrounds, they might care a lot more about revenues and unit economics over, say, the value of a user or the lifetime value of a user that's forecasted. And so, say a company like a Facebook or a Snapchat might have had trouble to raise capital in some cities where many of the VCs are bankers. I just spent 10 days over in Korea and in Japan, and there's been some massive home runs. From Kakao in Korea to so many in Japan, and there's so much talent out there that have worked for large conglomerates that are truly international. but yet still the entrepreneurs, partially because their local economies are so huge, are first and foremost thinking locally. And that's a very logical argument. Hey, my economy's so big, I don't need to look elsewhere. But still, their role models, the Samsungs of the world, are truly international companies.
So would you suggest for an entrepreneur raising a Series A round that they should focus more local rather than abroad?
What network do you want to tap into, right? And so, I don't know, if you're a young Mark Zuckerberg and you're targeting Canadian campuses, well, get your Canadian investor. If you want to be scaling internationally and you want to be talking with executives of large international conglomerates, then you might want to get those international investors. And in terms of the perspective, the global viewpoint, if you can tap into a VC firm like ours, but there are others, which has people a little bit everywhere, right? Where, yeah, okay, maybe I don't know the executive of someone in UK, but I have 3 colleagues over there who do, and there are other firms that do similar things, so that it's just one email and one forward away from getting that right intro to the top executive is someone that's 5, 6, 7, 10, 12 time zones away.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing, and you guys can disagree with me. What I'm hearing is that raising that round of capital is a little less tenuous on either side of the border. The playing field really has leveled, and it's really all about the identification of the skill set of the entrepreneur matched to the investor as they raise capital and as they move forward.
2 more key points, though. In addition to the capital and the mentorship and the board meeting, the structure, and all the things that a good investor brings, there are 2 really, really important things that some startups really benefit from. The first one is if you bring in the right investor in terms of brand cachet, it can help you hire that super talented person that would not otherwise accept your job offer. And that applies both locally, but for a lot of companies are trying to hire, say, an enterprise salesperson in Texas or New York or San Francisco, and they hear about you and your Canadian investor, that might not give you the external credibility that you're looking for. And so you might lose that talent. So that's a big one. And then a smaller but similar one is attention from the press, where a lot of the journalists, I don't know if they would admit to this, but what we've seen is that the journalists tend to gravitate more towards the startups that have had a top tier cachet investor. Because again, it gives the external credibility. So with the talent and with the press, sometimes you do want to get that international investor that brings that extra cachet, and it can't be a no-name international investor, but someone that brings that cachet that will help you land that superstar that will transform your business in a very indirect way.
So I'll just reinforce that. I was going to make the exact same point. One of the biggest values that you get from a VC is the brand name of that VC. It's the success of your business in the first couple of years is going to be largely dependent on, let's say, the skill of the founders and the early team that you can just sort of muscle your way through anything. The success beyond that is going to be almost entirely determined by the quality of talent that you're able to attract, and absolutely having a brand name VC that has a name that people are familiar with is enormously helpful with that. Basically, top level execs or people that you want to attract to your company oftentimes won't even reply to you unless you have that brand name VC backing you, and because they have so many other offers kind of flying their way. So I'll just strongly reinforce that.
That's super important, and something that people don't really think about. It's very difficult to find that top tier VC or the brand name VC. So in the absence of a bunch of those brand names in Canada, I mean, we have some, and we're getting better. I think the Canadian venture capital ecosystem is dramatically improving, and and our funds are getting bigger, and they're able to write bigger checks, and they're able to stay stay the course through many, many rounds and help those companies get really, I think, a fair ways down the playing field. Georgian being one, and Innovia being another, as examples. As we go to wrap up and open up for questions, what pieces of advice would you give to the entrepreneurs in this room who are going out past this conference to raise their Series A or Series B round? What advice would you give them?
As a math, computer science geek, I tend to gravitate more towards some quantitative things. And for me, it's about focusing on one or two central KPIs for your business. These are the KPIs that you'll present to lead your pitch decks when pitching for your next round of financing. These are the KPIs that influence your culture internally. When I worked for 5 years at that company that got acquired by Microsoft, we had these massive dashboards that tracked a specific KPIs. And for us, we were an ad-serving business. And so we knew there were two massive celebrations that we were going to have internally. The first ever second where we would serve 100,000 ads in that second. We knew the moment we hit that 100,000, we would all stop working and we would all celebrate. The other one was every trillionth ad served. And so our counters, we had an engineer convert our dashboard into a screensaver. So ultimately, it's not just about the KPIs for fundraising. It's about culture. It's about when you're recruiting, the new talent knows that this is like these 2 or 3 metrics are the key goals of the company. And these numbers should be everywhere in your business, and they should be tracked everywhere. And they also have to be KPIs. You can't be changing them every 2 or 3 months. Like, you can change them once in a while, but there should be some consistency to them, and everybody gravitates towards them. People tell their friends. When you're trying to recruit your friends to work for you, it's like, this are the things that we're working towards.
So I guess fundraising in a lot of ways, although it's obviously, of course, it's very important, it's an outcome. The most important thing is to work on the business and build a business that's worth funding. I mean, a lot of people almost view, especially these days as money has become a little bit easier to come by, they view fundraising as almost like the end goal. They view it as a milestone or an accomplishment, which I would say, think of fundraising as almost a very expensive credit card loan. With a credit card, you're paying 20% interest. With capital that you've raised, you got to pay it back tenfold. So it's actually much more expensive than a credit card loan. So there's really 3 things that you need to focus on as a founder. The first is make sure you set the vision for the business and make sure you're going in the right direction and you're solving a real problem that people have. The second is make sure you hire the absolute best people. I mean, every founder, every CEO needs to be neurotic and obsessive about the quality of talent that they bring into the business. You need to become the best at hiring the best people. And then the third thing is making sure you have enough capital in the bank. So if you do those 3 things, then ultimately that last piece will sort of fall into place.
So there seems to be this idea going around right now where you kind of start a company anywhere, but if you truly want to scale up the company, the best idea is to...
Thank you. So there seems to be this idea that you can start a company anywhere in the world, but if you want to really scale it up, the best idea is to move to Silicon Valley. And a large reason for that seems like is there's a lot of access to the growth capital that you would need to do that. And I'm just curious to get your guys' perspective on that. And you clearly have not done that, but I'm just curious to hear what you think.
So generally speaking, yes. I'm a heretic in the Canadian ecosystem. I do think you have a lot of advantages of being in the Bay Area. That has lessened to some extent. The cost of living has gotten insane. The average tenure of an engineer in the Bay Area is like 6 months now, which is just crazy. I mean, you can't build a business that way. I would say, though, still, the most important thing is not even access to capital, because now you can kind of get that anywhere. The most important thing is access to talent, and that's especially true as you scale. You can usually figure out how to get that those first 10, maybe 20 people into the business that are going to be really effective. But once you're growing to 50 to 100 and beyond, getting that executive talent in Canada is close to impossible. I mean, if you're looking at marketing, engineering, product, whatever. There's probably like 5 people in the country that really know how to scale a business in each of those kind of domains. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but that's how tight the market is. So that I would say is the main reason to be based in the Bay Area, because basically all of the best people are still, for the most part, there. So yeah, that's it. You will have those challenges if you stay in Canada. Although there are of course still some advantages, mainly related to cost and a bit less of a talent war kind of going on.
Do keep in mind in the middle ground there, New York's venture capital ecosystem, depending on what numbers you look at, is around 20 to 35% of the size of the Bay Area. So you have the wealth of capital there in New York, but you also have executives from media, from finance, from fashion, from pretty much any industry. The top execs are in New York, and you have the similar time zone. And so, my firm, we're 50-50 between B2B and B2C. In B2C, I think it's a little bit easier to just have all your talent be in Canada. In B2B, it's hard to not have amazing salespeople and oftentimes customer success people where your clients are. And if you want to have the clients in the US and in Europe and South America and wherever else, sometimes you really need to have those sales and customer service people there too.
Hi, thanks. So we're in the position now of having to identify the right people to bring onto the team as we, finish our first rounds of fundraising and start actually scaling up. Can you give some quick tips on, how to identify the right people? Like going out into this wide world of people that all want a job, how do you find the right person and vet them?
Yeah, so it's very hard, and it takes many years of practice to get good at it. What I'll tell you is there's a methodology called top grading, and there's a book called Who that's really great as a guide. I mean, I can give you a 30-second blurb here, but really that's a good starting point to learn how to hire effectively. Ultimately, what most people do is use various techniques of voodoo hiring practices that totally don't work, and everyone uses them. Ranging from doing puzzle questions to just doing chit-chat style interviews and just using your gut to decide. None of that stuff works. There's a few very specific things that actually do work, and I recommend looking at that book and studying. I mean, there's lots and lots of people that have done their PhDs on how to hire effectively. There's well-established research of the kind of stuff that works and the kind of stuff that doesn't work. Google is an example of a company that actually does it right, and they've written a book on it, I think. So just read about how other people have done it and follow those methodologies. So just don't wing it. If you wing it, your success rate is going to be 1 in 10 if you're lucky, especially with sales.
Absolutely, and also always be recruiting, right? So you're ready now to hire these people. Hopefully you've been meeting these people. You've been going to the right meetups or on the right discussion forums or whatever ways it takes to, a little bit like with venture financing, same thing with recruiting, to be building the relationships over an extended period of time. Even though you feel like you don't have time right now to be building those relationships with potential talent that you might be hiring only 6 or 9 months from now, find a way to build those relationships and to foster that so that when you are ready to be in his shoes, that you already have the people at the edge of your fingertips.
All right, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for your questions. I know there's more, but I'm being given the hook by Sarah, and I don't want to get killed by Sarah. I'm going to make you the bad guy or girl. But these guys are going to be around for other questions, so come and grab them. And we'll be around for the rest of the conference. Well, you'll be around for today. But we'll be around for the rest of the conference. If you've got other questions, just grab everybody. And thank you for hanging out with us for the last 30 minutes or so.